Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is lovely to be back. I have been recording for the past couple of weeks due to the Easter holidays, but we're here now, and I'm really happy about it. And I've got some quite exciting news. So from now on, all episodes are going to be uploaded to Spotify. I have a Spotify channel set up for Polymath. Got that beautiful AI-generated image as the cover for it as well. And this is really great because it means that it kind of solves my timing issue, because rather than being worried about how I'm going to pace myself and whether I'm going to be able to get through all the content and whether I should have to pick topics that are short enough for me to finish talking about in 1 hour, it just means I can focus on just talking and getting you guys high quality content, which is fantastic for everyone involved, really. And it's also the way I'm going to do it is in the 1 hour radio slot, I'm going to get through as much content as I can, and then I'm just going to pause it when my slot's over, get back home, keep recording, and then upload the full episode to Spotify. So yeah, and that's it. And then just a little reminder on what this show is, just in case people are listening to this episode as the first one or tuning in for the first time. Polymath, it's kind of like each episode is like a TED Talk. I just talk about something which I find interesting, which I think other people will find interesting as well. And we cover a huge breadth of topics here, which is kind of the point of the podcast, and it's where the name actually comes from. But there are two key differences between this podcast, or radio show, I should say, and TED Talks. The first one is that TED Talks are professional and academic, whereas it's more of like a colloquial, kind of conversational style of talking. And also, I'm not a professional. I don't have qualifications. I'm just someone who reads a lot and happens to memorize and kind of keep hold of a lot of the information that I read. And I like to read about things which I happen to be quite excited to share with other people. And that brings me to the second key difference, which is just that this is not like a scripted podcast. I'm not revising the content material before each episode. It's unscripted. It's off the cuff. It's based on what I remember, and it's based on the stuff that I want to talk about. And that is sort of the nature of the Polymath radio show here. And today's episode of the Polymath radio show is morality innate or learned? And I'm particularly excited for this one, actually, because the past few episodes have had quite a politics, economic, kind of anthropology bent, which is lovely, which is great. And those are three topics which I'm really passionate about. But Polymath is all about breadth, and I want to explore some other kind of not more interesting, because these are really interesting subjects, but more subjects that are interesting. And psychology, particularly evolutionary psychology, is something which I find really interesting. And with that said, let's get into it. So is morality innate or learned? Drum roll, please. The answer is both, which is a really unsatisfactory answer. But of course, with any of these kind of major binary questions, and especially with the whole nature or nurture idea, when applied to any debate ever, the answer is always going to be a bit of both. But given that that's quite an unsatisfactory answer, let's just kind of go through that in a more satisfactory way. So as we can see, morality can't be purely innate because there's such a huge range of morality around the world. I mean, there's lots of different societies and cultures follow different moral norms, different moral beliefs, different moral ideologies, different laws which are kind of meant to uphold aspects of morality. And then, of course, individuals vary massively in their own kind of personal morality as well. I mean, the whole field of moral philosophy exists purely because morality cannot be fixed and inherent in human nature. And then multiple other academic fields, like politics or economics, for example, do involve moral questions. And huge amounts of the debates that occur in these fields occur due to discrepancies in morality. But that said, there are also commonalities. I mean, first of all, despite the huge range in laws of every society, they all tend to prescribe things such as don't kill people, or don't steal, or don't harm people without cause, or things like that. And there's also this kind of there are commonalities in people's conceptions of morality. People tend to dislike unjustified, that's the key thing, unjustified cruelty, inequality, treachery, unfairness, things like that. And obviously, how people justify these things, or what they call unjustified or justified, varies massively and is part of the whole puzzle of morality and gives rise to the huge variations of morality that we see in people's beliefs. But the point isn't really that moral behavior is often circumvented, but rather that these concepts even exist. The point is that these moral conceptions, the idea of disliking meaningless cruelty or meaningless injustice or meaningless inequality or treachery and betrayal, it's more the fact that's even a thing in human nature in a universal sense. And another quite interesting tendency of humans is that people tend to think in a binary way of in-group versus out-group, wherein there are groups of people that an individual may identify with and therefore feel favor towards, and there are groups of people which individuals may not identify with and therefore feel enmity towards. A big example of this kind of binary thinking is politics, whereas people who are right-wing tend to see other right-wingers as their in-group and left-wingers as their out-group. You also see this in nationality, where, for example, in nationalism, a Frenchman may see other French people as his in-group and Germans as his out-group. But the point but I'm not trying to make a political point here per se. I'm just trying to say that the psychological mechanisms which give rise to that kind of thinking and the consequence which those psychological mechanisms have are part of human nature. And not only am I going to say that they're part of human nature, I'm going to say that I can explain the evolutionary basis of these. And we're going to get into a bit more detail on that. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what I'm talking about later. Don't worry, we're going to get to it. This is really just a kind of sweeping summary. What I'm really trying to say is that morality is both innate and learned. But in a more nuanced sense, you can say that the basic psychological building blocks, the mental faculties, you could say, that underpin morality. So, for example, the emotions of empathy, the idea of loyalty, the desire for justice and fairness, and of course the idea of in-group, out-group binary thinking, these are innate. And some of these are seen in other animals. So, for example, humans are not the only animals capable of altruism. Other animals will come to the aid of other animals, even when it doesn't necessarily benefit them. So this is seen in animals like elephants, dogs, etc. However, whilst the basic building blocks that underpin morality are innate, morality as a fully fledged conception, which uses these basic ingredients to create radically different results, is clearly an environmental process, because the whole point is that human beings kind of use these psychological building blocks to come to different conclusions and to come to different ideas of morality based on this acculturating process whereby someone's environment determines their specific form of morality. And the same thing we often see in societies as well. Now, to shed any real insight into the mental faculties, these kind of psychological building blocks of morality, which I'm talking about here, we have to turn to, actually, I'll just give you some examples: love, empathy, loyalty, in-group and out-group thinking, and the tendency to approbate, is that approbate the right word? To conceive one's in-group as being moral and to conceive one's out-group as being immoral. All of these tendencies, to gain any insight on how these work and how they develop, we need to turn to evolutionary psychology. And I'm saying that word with a bit of musicality in my voice because it's important. So evolutionary psychology is the idea of studying evolution to explain the workings of the human mind. It's also called sociobiology, although the word sociobiology is a bit stigmatized now because it tends to be associated with right-wing groups who misinterpret the doctrines of evolutionary psychology and then use them to support their own ideologies. That's just a side note, but I'm saying it because it is actually quite relevant in the history of evolutionary psychology. But evolutionary psychology, it again looks at like a mental process. For example, the emotion of love, or the human desire for social status, or the fact that humans feel happy or sad, etc., etc. Just any kind of psychological mechanism or process, anything like that. And they look at it through the lens of evolution. And they think, how is it that this evolved? Because once you accept evolution as the way in which organisms are designed, you come to the inescapable conclusion that human minds are shaped by those same evolutionary forces. So it can be therefore really, really revealing to look at mental process through the lens of evolution and the logic of evolution and think, how could this have come about? Personally, I really, really like evolutionary psychology because I feel as if it provides the best explanation for human nature, coupled with some other fields like neurobiology, neuroscience, for example. I shouldn't say neurobiology because neuroscience is the umbrella term encompassing neurobiology and other related fields. And obviously, evolutionary psychology is not a perfect discipline, and it's also something which is quite difficult to test, although there are ways of getting around it, as we're going to explore later. It's something which is quite difficult to test, and obviously with any scientific discipline, there is always the possibility for error brought in through human incompetence or bias or lack of technology to yield the appropriate results or whatever, etc., etc., etc. But I feel as if out of all the possible methods of inquiry, to understand human nature, to understand what we are like and how we are designed and why the world is the way it is, evolutionary psychology is the best way to go about it. And for that reason, there's going to be quite a bit of evolutionary psychology popping up in Polymath. We haven't really been seeing too much of it so far. It's been more of like, again, a politics, economics, anthropology bent. But don't worry, we will be getting onto it. Now, let's just kind of talk about the moral sentiments that I'm talking about. These kind of mental building blocks underlying the development of morality. So this is things like love, empathy, loyalty, desire for justice, desire for equality when merited, etc., etc. But maybe we can think of these moral sentiments in a more kind of categorized, organized, orderly way. And in fact, someone has already done that. You see, one of my favorite books ever is a book called The Righteous Mind, and it's this by this psychology called by this psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, who, working with a team, has proposed something called moral foundations theory. And this is, of course, a theory, but it is a very, very compelling theory based on some, like, good method. Like, it's not just some dudes in a room being like, wouldn't this be crazy? Like, it's based on actual research and understanding. And I'll explain the theory. Moral foundations theory is that kind of like, this kind of idea that the moral sentiments, the kind of psychological building blocks of morality, and of course the core tenets that comprise morality, can be categorized into these innate psychological modules of morality. And Jonathan Haidt and his team proposed 6. One of these modules is care/harm. This is essentially the idea of empathy, the idea that humans care about the well-being of other humans, even if they may not be related to them, and therefore tend to dislike arbitrary cruelty, for example. The second kind of psychological module proposed in the moral foundations theory is the fairness/cheating module, whereas human beings have a tendency to like fairness and proportionality. They like the idea of people getting their just desserts. They like the idea of people getting what's coming to them, of there being some kind of justice. Hence, they like fairness and dislike cheating, hence the name of the module. Sorry if you can hear noise in the background, by the way. I'm doing this in my room because the burst computer is currently not working and the window's open and there are little sound effects popping in from the street below, etc. Now, the third moral module is the loyalty/betrayal module. People tend to like the idea of loyalty and being loyal to someone who has done you good and not screwing them over. And of course, they dislike screwing people over they dislike it when people screw others over when they've been... Why? I'm struggling to word myself here. I'm not sure why. People dislike it when an individual screws another individual over when the latter individual has helped them in the past. That is an extraordinarily bulky sentence, but I'm sure you guys can understand what I mean. The fourth moral tenet is authority/subversion. People tend to like and respect justified authority. When I say justified authority, I'm not really talking about states and stuff like that. I'm more talking about something like parental authority. Like an authority that isn't imposed on you through coercion, but it's just someone you naturally tend to look up to and respect. And the flip side of that moral module is that people tend to dislike subversion of this of this kind of reverence. I shouldn't say reverence, subversion of this respect. People essentially think respect should be given when it is due, and that it is bad not to give respect when it is due. That is what the authority/subversion module is. The fifth module is sanctity/degradation. This module is a little bit more difficult to explain because actually in Western society, we don't really have much of a conception for this module, but it is something which is existing in numerous other societies. In fact, Western society, modern Western society, is a massive kind of moral/anthropological aberration in this. But the idea of something being ritually pure or ritually clean or sacrosanct or sacred, or the idea of like the idea of there just being some things that you shouldn't disrespect or make fun of, that is what Jonathan Haidt means by the sanctity module foundation. We find it moral to revere certain things, and we find it immoral when those revered things are degraded. A modern example of this would be, for example, when conservative Americans talk about the American flag and how you shouldn't step on the American flag or burn the American flag, and how the idea of burning the American flag is seen as an outrage. It's because of that moral, innate psychological module of sanctity. Now, of course, this may beg the question for you. You might be thinking, well, I don't care if someone steps my flag or burns my flag. That's not evidence that that psychological module doesn't exist. That's just evidence that your brain doesn't apply that moral module to political matters like the flag. This is really what I mean when I say that morality is both innate and learned. Because while these psychological moral modules that I'm describing, that I'm going through, are innate in human beings, the way that they're applied is most certainly not innate in human beings, hence the variation in morality that we see. So the sixth moral foundation, in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, the sixth kind of module is the liberty/oppression module, whereas generally people do not like having their freedom and their autonomy impinged upon. People find oppression immoral. People find kind of just in general a loss of autonomy and free will and freedom an inherently bad thing unless that is justified in some way. So for example, the sociological idea of there being a social contract wherein society is composed of individuals who sacrifice some of their liberty and autonomy for the sake of safety and security, that's not necessarily immoral, because in that instance the loss of autonomy is justified. But the idea of like oppression, the idea of tyranny, is fundamentally a one where loss of autonomy is not justified. And by the way, the liberty oppression moral foundation doesn't just apply to politics and people living in states. It applies to everyday interactions as well. It's why, for example, people stereotypically do not like being told what to do, and they resent bossiness, and they resent imperiousness, and they are sensitive to the idea of kind of being controlled by other people, because people fundamentally see freedom as a good thing. But again, what I want to say to you is that these moral foundations, while these are nice, neat classifications of innate moral sentiments, these moral sentiments can be kind of applied in different ways. So we still are seeing variation in morality that's learned. It being innate morality is only half of the story here. I'm just talking about it because it feels like it's the part of the story which merits more explanation. Like most people, if you ask them, isn't morality innate or learned? Most people can clearly see how it's learned, and it's the product of someone's environment, but not so clearly see how it's innate and genetic. So I'm just going over the innate, genetic, neurological side of it with a bit more detail, just so we can kind of get that understanding here. Now, of course, if you look at these six moral foundations, and I'm just going to go over them again: care/harm, fairness/cheating, loyalty/betrayal, authority/subversion, sanctity/degradation, and liberty/oppression. Different individuals and different cultures emphasize these moral foundations in different proportions. They also conceptualize these foundations in different ways. For example, caring for oneself versus caring for the community. Like, for example, let me word that better. Different moral systems can emphasize things like individualism or collectivism. So modern Western society is known, anthropology, it's famous in terms of history for being an individualist society. And that's not due to like a subversion of humanity's moral foundations. It's because these moral foundations are applied and conceptualized in a different way. One wherein the kind of happiness and the care for the individual is taken as a higher priority over happiness and care for the community and the collective. What I'm saying is the different moralities that we see across the world are due to these different moral foundations, these different moral sentiments being applied and understood in different ways and being emphasized to different extents in different people. I'm going to get onto that whole emphasize in different extents to different people in a moment, because actually that's kind of getting into the realm of political psychology in just a little bit. But we're going to get into that in a moment. I'm not going to throw us in the deep end to a topic when we haven't even laid the kind of groundwork for that topic first. Now, this all kind of begs the question, because this is really an evolutionary psychology talk. It all begs the question, how did these moral foundations evolve in the first place? And here's the key thing. They evolved for selfish reasons to help humans survive. Natural selection is an amoral process. I'm not necessarily saying it's immoral, because natural selection isn't the result of some conscious design. So it can't be that there's like a malevolent conscious designer. But natural selection as a process has no conception of morality. Natural selection only really cares about passing on genes to the next generation. By definition, that is just a logical conclusion to make from the premises of natural selection. All natural selection is doing is saying that genes get passed to the next generation, and based on like how good those genes are at causing their organisms to survive, the proportion of organisms with those genes will wax or wane until eventually a gene, if it's good for survival, makes its way throughout the whole species owning that gene. That's all natural selection is. It's all about genes being passed to the next generation. The ultimate logic of natural selection is selfish. There is no inbuilt idea of morality in natural selection. You could argue even that natural selection is an evil process, because nature's messed up. Nature's all about, beings destroying other beings, competing with other beings. It's all about violence. It's all about destruction. It's all about, nature's not all fun and games, we should not, I'm not saying that we should adopt natural selection's values as our own values. That's not true at all. That is a ruinously wrong conclusion to draw from natural selection. Natural selection does not tell us what we should be doing. It tells us what, in an evolutionary context, can help humans survive. And it's also worth knowing that by human action and human effort, we can kind of free ourselves from the shackles of natural selection and propagate behaviors that may not have evolved by themselves, but can be used to help us survive. So, for example, the idea of glasses, for example. Glasses is all about how the natural process of natural selection can be thwarted by human intervention, by helping other members of our species to survive, even when otherwise they may have been rooted out in a harsh environment by natural selection. And I don't think anyone's out here saying that we shouldn't be giving glasses to people so that evolution can take its course. That's obviously ridiculous. The point I'm trying to make here is that natural selection acts for selfish purposes, but humans shouldn't. That's what I'm saying. But what mechanisms led to these moral foundations evolving if they were ostensibly for selfish purposes? It's the key thing that humans are social animals, and we need other humans to survive. Not only that, but humans are animals who are born extremely vulnerable. Humans are bipedal. We walk on two legs. However, that also means that the birth canal of a human is limited in diameter, which means that you can't get a massively developed head out of it, which means that you can't get a massively developed brain out of it, which means that when women give birth, babies come out quite undeveloped. You'll see animal documentaries where an animal gets born, and that will just be zooming off straight away. Babies are not like that because humans are bipedal, and we can't, there's the space isn't there for us to be squeezing out babies with big brains. So humans are born very young and very vulnerable, which means that they need to be cared for when they're vulnerable. But here's the thing. Caring for babies is a hell of a lot of work. It's a huge, huge investment in terms of resources and time and energy. And the only reason why parents do it, really, is love. That's the fundamental reason why parents have evolved to want to raise their kids, because they love their kids. If we lived in a universe where parents never loved their kids, you wouldn't really have, if you were like some hunter-gatherer living in the environment in which humans evolved, where resources and time are scarce, you wouldn't take care of a kid if you had zero emotional attachment to it. If no one had any emotional attachment to their kid, natural selection just wouldn't work. People's genes wouldn't get passed on to the next generation. Hence, love develops as an emotion to kind of help people take care of their kids. And once that original mental faculty of love develops, evolution can run with that, and it can build on that, and it can allow that emotional feeling to be applied in other contexts and to other people. So, for example, from love, you may get empathy, because a key part of love is caring about others and wanting them to be happy. You may also get the idea of loyalty from it, wherein you want to be loyal to someone who loves you. You are grateful to people who have done you well. To people who have helped you out, and you are loyal to them, and this helps you forge a bond between them. It's the same thing with a kid and a parent. So if you're a kid, you're hugely reliant on your parent. You need to listen to what they're telling you to do. As a hunter-gatherer, you're not born with the knowledge of which plants to eat and what to forage and what to do and how to live. You're dependent on a parent to do that. So it's important that you, as a kid, have a strong emotional bond with your parent, and that you trust what they say, and that you are grateful for their help for you, so that you love them. Because if you love them, you're going to stick with them and do what they say. And then also, it's really, really difficult to, for example, raise a kid by yourself. So it makes sense to also have a sense of love to your partner who can raise a kid with you. Humans are not completely monogamous, by the way. There is a whole range of evidence for this. That's really a conversation for a different time. That's really like another polymath topic. It may be something that I'll choose to return to. But what I'm saying is, it's once you acknowledge that love can evolve to help facilitate the bond between child and parent, it's very easy for evolution to extend that feeling of love from just child to parent to between parents to help solidify their bond and to help carry out the necessary coordination in raising a kid, because raising a kid is fucking hard. It's stressful. And if you don't love the person who you're raising a kid with, it's really hard and really stressful. And it may just tempt you to leave altogether and give up. So love, we can see, is an adaptation which is really, really useful in getting humans to pass on their genes to the next generation. But then another thing, humans are social animals. So we require lots of other quite sophisticated moral sentiments. We need kind of conceptions of, we need to like fairness and dislike cheating, because this means that in a society, we naturally tend to resist people cheating us. We naturally tend to resist unfairness, and therefore we resist kind of us not getting our fair share in terms of social and material resources. We may like authority and dislike subversion of that authority because it's adaptive for kids to recognize their parents' authority. It's beneficial to do that. But also in a society, when I say society, I don't want you to imagine some vast empire, some industrial state. I want you to imagine a band of several dozen hunter-gatherers, because that's the society that humans evolved to live in. Those are the kind of social dynamics we evolved to deal with. And in a society, there are also going to be people who can teach you stuff and who may be more competent than you and who may deserve respect, who may be able to help you and therefore deserve respect, because by respecting them, you encourage them to help you. So the idea of authority developing as a moral foundation, that's not due to some kind of conscious creator giving humans some deep respect for authority. It's because, no, sometimes it's actually beneficial to respect people because it means that you can learn from them. And then, of course, subversion is just the negative of that moral feeling of authority. And then liberty and oppression. Of course, as like a human being in a society, you're going to develop some kind of moral conception for liking to be free, because being free, generally for survival, is good. However, it's also possible that as a human being, you'd be able to tolerate a loss of liberty and autonomy if it was justified. Because, again, natural selection is a selfish process. It works to help humans propagate their genes. So it wouldn't be very good if humans would never, ever tolerate any loss of autonomy, even if that meant survival. Because no, remember, these moral foundations have evolved to be a little bit flexible, and they can be flexible in how they develop and how they apply, because they're built for us to survive. And of course, humans deal with lots of different situations. We'll kind of get a little bit into that in a moment. We'll get into kind of the plasticity and the flexibility of the human brain. And the mechanism that we can say is responsible for developing these moral sentiments is something called reciprocal altruism, which is basically altruism, but with the implicit expectation and the evolutionary condition that altruism is eventually returned. Because, that interactions between individuals is a plausible mechanism for humans developing moral foundations, because reciprocal altruism, the idea of helping someone out in exchange for them helping you out in return, is beneficial for human survival. And you can clearly see that. So what's really going on is that all these moral sentiments, all these moral feelings which we've just talked about, the care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation, liberty, oppression, all of these are designed to encourage reciprocal altruism and to enforce it. So, for example, the idea of betrayal, the idea of unfairness, the idea of of subversion, the idea of oppression, we find this reprehensible precisely because it's really useful evolutionary that we find this reprehensible, so that if someone is mean to us, or if someone doesn't help us, or if someone doesn't return the favor, we feel angry towards them and we won't help them again. And it's also important to be able to find fairness moral and loyalty moral, so that if we are engaged in a mutually profitable relationship of helping someone else, then that mutually profitable relationship of reciprocal altruism continues. All these moral sentiments are doing is encouraging us to help other people. It's encouraging other people to help us in return. And it's encouraging us not to help people who screw us over. That really is the basis of why all of this stuff developed. Now, there's another field of study called game theory. Game theory is the study of mapping out people's behavior using mathematical models. And here's the thing. Remember how I said in evolutionary psychology it's really difficult to test, but there are test theories, but there are some ways around it? Game theory is one of those theories. If we imagine humans, let's say hunter-gatherers existing in a plane, and they're encountering each other, and people have to deal with each other, and people can help each other, but they can also screw each other over, we can use game theory to mathematically model what would be the most beneficial way for humans to act towards each other. Because game theory is all about how, if you take more than one individual and you put them in a situation where their best course of action depends on what other people do, you can then mathematically model what would the best course of action to be for someone to carry out be, depending on whatever that other person chooses to do. I really hope I'm explaining this right. Game theory is quite a difficult thing to explain. I recommend reading some introductory books on game theory. But the point is, you can model game theory using computer simulations. And the significance of this is that we can use computer simulations of game theory to model kind of evolutionary strategies. So you can take a bunch of people, let's say a bunch of people, have you heard of the phrase tit for tat? It's like the idea of saying, I will respond to you based on how you respond to me. I will give a tit for a tat, i.e. basically, you reap what you sow. Basically, if you screw me over, I will screw you over. Basically, if you cooperate with me, I will cooperate with you. If you use game theory to kind of look at models of human behavior and see how they would play out, you can see that the moral sentiments encouraging reciprocal altruism actually make evolutionary sense. Because if you have a bunch of people who just always help each other out, no matter how many times they've been screwed over, then those kinds of people would never have evolved in the first place. Because if you're in an environment where everyone's looking out for survival, and you have these indiscriminate moral sentiments, like you just want to help people, no matter how people treat you, you just want to help people, you're just going to get screwed over every time. Similarly, if you only have the capacity to screw people over, if you have no moral sentiments encouraging you to cooperate with other people, if the only thing getting you to cooperate with people is sheer cold hard interest, then everyone just screws each other over at the first available opportunity, and it's really hard to develop mutually beneficial cooperation with people. What makes sense from a mathematical perspective is some kind of entity who can model their behavior based on how other people react towards them, who can say, if you help me out, I will help you out, and we will have a mutually beneficial relationship. And who can also say, if you screw me over, I will screw you over, and I will not allow you to exploit me. And this strategy in game theory is known as the tit-for-tat strategy. It's essentially, and by the way, this may make very little sense because I'm not explaining it very thoroughly, but if you just Google search Axelrod evolutionary psychology, Axelrod was the game theorist who ran this kind of game theory model to test different evolutionary strategies. And if you just search up tit-for-tat evolutionary strategy, you'll get much more information on what I'm talking about. What I'm really trying to say, and what the only message that needs to be carried from this is, we can prove mathematically that reciprocal altruism and the moral sentiments we've developed for it work. Because reciprocal altruism in human beings is all about being altruistic and helping other people out in the expectation that they'll help you out back. And this is how altruism developed. And obviously nowadays, I say nowadays, the idea of altruism, people say the whole point of altruism is that you aren't expecting a payback. The whole point of altruism is that you want to help people purely for the sake of helping people. Yes, this is true. But what I'm trying to say is that the reason why altruism evolved in the first place was because of reciprocal processes, wherein humans could help each other and not consciously expect a reward, or maybe not consciously expect a reward, but the point being that they likely would have been rewarded for their altruism by more altruism, and that would have helped them survive. And that's how altruism evolved in the first place. What I'm not saying is that every time humans be altruistic, they're expecting a payback. No, I'm expecting that when natural selection evolved altruism in humans, it was with the implicit assumption that altruism would tend to be a reciprocal process and therefore boost the survivability of humans. If you can hear a page turn in the background, by the way, it's because I've got these kind of rough notes along with me just to help me out. But again, this is most definitely unscripted. And another thing I want to return to very quickly is the idea of in-group, out-group thinking, this idea of binary thinking, because I'm concerned that I didn't explain enough properly. The idea of in-group, out-group thinking, it refers to this natural tendency that humans have to think, to classify people in terms of an in-group, i.e. people who are one of you, i.e. us, and an out-group, i.e. people who are an other, and therefore a them. And you see this kind of basic tendency in loads of different fields of human life, including politics, which I talked about, but also religion. And if you'll notice, loads of religions, the Abrahamic religions are a great example, talk about being nice to the other people in your religion and also being strong against and converting the people outside your religion. All the Abrahamic religions, by which I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are like this, by the way. They all encourage decency towards people in your in-group, in your religious in-group, and efficiency and aggression and supremacy and superiority against those in your out-group. This is one of the reasons why religious fundamentalism, like Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, tends to revert to violence, because all of these religions developed in a context where the whole point was to unify a large in-group together and to get them to think competitively against an out-group. So this binary thinking, this tendency to segregate humans and to think in terms of us and them, is a part of human nature. And I've talked about politics and religion, but in reality, it manifests itself all the time. You can see it even in social groups, for example, like in the tendency for people to forgive their friends for moral transgressions and to see the best in their friends, but also to think of certain groups of people as an other. This is how stuff like racism or xenophobia works, by the way, because a racist person will see individuals of other ethnic groups as a them, as someone in their out group, and therefore, by definition, immoral. Humans tend to think of this binary in-group, out-group, and is appropriate the right word? I remember having this internal debate like 30 minutes ago. They tend to ascribe morality to their in-group and immorality to their out-group. Even if that description of morality is completely illogical, people will tend to do it anyway because people are not necessarily logical creatures. By the way, the idea of human beings not being inherently rational, that's a topic for a whole nother talk. But we will do it because it's a really interesting topic. But what I'm trying to say is that humans have this binary moral thinking of in-group and out-group. And this is very important in people's conception of morality. And it's also very important in explaining why otherwise moral people can go on to do horrific atrocities. You see this a lot in Nazi Germany, where lots of members of the SS would be described by their community as upstanding members of the community and good family members and kind people. And then these same people would do absolutely horrific things to minorities, especially Jews. Like myself, But anyway. And that's because of this whole in-group, out-group thinking. People tend to think in terms of an in-group and out-group, and they tend to therefore bestow empathy and loyalty and respect and sanctity and all the other positive moral attributes onto their in-group, and they tend to ascribe moral negatives on the out-group. For example, people who are racist will tend to dislike other minorities and see them as immoral in some way. People who are xenophobic will tend to see foreigners as immoral in some way. People who are, let's say, sexist will tend to see women as immoral in some way. People who are homophobic will tend to see homosexuals as immoral in some way, because the whole point of this in-group and out-group thinking is that it is a moral process. And it's not necessarily rational. It doesn't necessarily, which is why it's so difficult to change people's minds. It's just a way that human beings think. So the question is, why would this have evolved? Well, it's evolved because in the environment that human beings grew up in, it was a tough environment, and a lot of threat came from other human beings. And it's weird because as a human being, let's say you're a hunter-gatherer, you're in a weird situation because on the one hand, you have to cooperate with other human beings, other hunter-gatherers in order to survive. On the other hand, many of your threats are other hunter-gatherers. They are neighboring villages. So it actually makes perfect evolutionary sense for humans to develop an in-group, out-group kind of binary moral thinking where humans are encouraged towards loyalty and empathy towards their in-group, and they are encouraged towards hostility and a desire for, and kind of a perception of threat and a perception of immorality among their out-group. That makes complete evolutionary sense when you consider the kind of ancestral environment in which humans grew up in. The question that remains is how that mode of thinking arise in the first place. Now, there is a theory called group selection. The idea of group selection is that natural selection doesn't just occur on the individual. It occurs on the level of the individual. It occurs on the level between groups of people as well. And the idea is that a group where people had evolved in-group, out-group thinking, and therefore were very loyal to their group and very hostile towards other groups, would have been really good at competing and really good at kind of establishing the supremacy of their group. And by that mechanism, by group selection, the idea of an in-group, out-group binary thinking may have evolved. However, the problem with group selection is that it doesn't really explain how this kind of stuff would have all evolved in the first place. Because if you're in just like a group of people milling around, and you have one individual of that group who has in-group, out-group thinking, and is therefore really loyal to their group, but no one else in their group is particularly loyal to them, then they would just get exploited. And therefore, that wouldn't be a good way of passing on their genes to the next generation. What I'm trying to say is, the idea of group selection, developing the moral sentiments, doesn't really make sense because as an individual, whoever is the first to develop these moral sentiments could just get exploited by other people who didn't have these moral sentiments. And therefore, that trait would not be adaptive, and therefore, it would not be likely to pass its gene on to the next generation. What's much more likely is that the whole in-group, out-group thinking developed on an individual scale. So, for example, it could have started by how, like, a parent is much more likely to see their child as in-group, and to see other humans who are potential threats to their child as out-group, and how a child is obviously likely to see their parent as in-group, and to see other people who are potential threats to the parent-child duo, or the parents-child trio, I should say, as a threat. And then once that mental capacity for in-group, out-group developed, as humans banded together in more large societies, the idea of an in-group became expanded to a greater and greater group of people. So hunter-gatherer bands, who are generally related by kin, would probably see their kin as part of their in-group, and non-kin as part of their out-group. And then as people united into larger and larger societies who are unrelated, the breadth of in-group that people were able to that people conceptualized grew, and the breadth of the out-group also grew, to the point where you get to something like modern nationalism, where you have, let's say, I don't know, Italians seeing millions of other Italians as their in-group and millions of non-Italians as their out-group. This isn't to say that humans became more and more sophisticated and cognitively advanced and able to conceive of greater groups of people. It is to say rather that the idea of in-group, out-group could have evolved simply as a mechanism to keep family units coherent and to keep family members loyal to each other and suspicious of outsiders who might pose a threat to them. And the idea is that that fundamental psychological mechanism of in-group, out-group thinking could then kind of develop in accordance with an individual's environment, so that when it benefited the individual, they would have a conception of their in-group as being many, many people, according to the size of the society that they lived in. And they could adjust the size of their out-group as well to, let's say, accommodate a greater number of threats. The idea is that in-group, out-group thinking develops for a clear evolutionary reason, and then that psychological mechanism evolves in human beings. But in a human being, the way that in-group, out-group binary thinking mechanism is harnessed, and the way that it develops, and the way that it's realized, is dependent on your environment and is dependent on circumstances and is developed on the situation in which you live, which is really the fundamental message of this talk, which is that, yes, the foundations for morality are innate, but how those foundations are used, how these adaptations, the form that these adaptations take in the mind of and the psyche of the individual is variable and depends on someone's environment. And it's just really, really important to clarify with everything that we've just talked about, everything we talked about and how morality develops and how morality developed for a selfish person to be selfish reasons, to benefit the individual. All of this is not something that humans are aware of consciously. When humans feel moral emotions, when you feel love, when you feel empathy, when you feel loyalty, when you feel respect, you're not thinking, I'm going to feel these emotions because this will be good for propagating my genes. No, that's silly. Or when you feel altruism, the whole point of altruism in our experience is that it's without reward, is that it's non-reciprocal. But this brings us to a really, really important point about evolution and evolutionary psychology. Natural selection is designed to maximize fitness. Fitness just being the ability of an individual to survive and pass on its genes in its habitat. But individuals should not be thought of as fitness maximizers in the same way. Individuals should be thought of as adaptation executors. Natural selection imbues us with adaptations which in general support our species' fitness. In this case, the adaptations are these mental faculties, these emotions of love, these aversions to injustice, these modes of thinking of in-group, out-group. These are adaptations and they are executed by us. However, they are executed by us imperfectly. These adaptations, because here's the thing, humans inhabit a hugely broad range of environments. I'm not just talking about physical environments, I'm talking about social environments. Human beings just across the world live in wildly different cultures and societies and institutions, and even in hunter-gatherer society. The hunter-gatherer societies display an enormous variety in their kind of cultures and their behaviors and the way that people act and the way that people behave to one another. Humans live in a huge range of environments, and these adaptations are general adaptations designed to benefit us in general. They are not tailor-made for us as individuals, which means that sometimes they can be flawed. Also, these adaptations evolve in an ancestral environment where we lived as hunter-gatherers, which is fundamentally different to the one that we live in now. But what's important here is that the brain, because humans can inhabit such a wide variety of environments, even like as we were evolving as hunter-gatherers, even then, we lived in a huge range of cultures and material environments and social environments. What's most important of all in natural selection, I say most, that's arguable, but I just mean what's really important in natural selection is that human brains are flexible and our mental adaptations are flexible. And the way that we can apply these mental adaptations are flexible. So for example, the whole in-group, out-group binary thinking, just to return to that example, is extremely flexible. We can, do you know what I just realized? My laptop's really low on battery. Let me just charge that real quick. So, like our conception of who is in our in-group, who is in our out-group, how is that defined, that's all really flexible. And our kind of application of morality, i.e., who do we care about? Who do we want to harm? What do we see as fair? What do we see as cheating? What do we see as equal? What do we see as unequal? What do we see as sacred? What do we see as unsacred? What do we see as bearing authority? Etc., etc., etc. All of our precise moral conceptions are flexible because human mental adaptations have evolved to be flexible because this is an evolutionary necessity. Also, genetic variation between individuals is also a thing. And because this affects people's brain structure, it also affects the kind of weighting that people give to different moral foundations. So, neurobiology is variable. Cultures and environments are variable. Humans are both variable in a genetic and environmental sense. So flexibility and plasticity in our brains is important, and it also means that the moral sentiments aren't always perfect or adaptive for our survival, because our moral sentiments evolved to help human beings generally, not to help you specifically in your specific situation. So sometimes the moral sentiments can become really maladaptive. A key example of this is overthinking. People's idea of caring too much about how other people feel, caring too much about whether other people like them. But you can apply maladaptiveness to any moral sentiment. So let's take the authority subversion moral foundation. It would be maladaptive if someone had like a crippling respect for authority to the point where it stifled their own free thought and objectivity, and yet people do that. Or for example, some people have a huge crippling attachment to liberty to the point where they won't accept restraints on their authority, for example, parental advice and guidance, even when it's beneficial to them. Or another thing, altruism, the idea of helping someone who couldn't possibly ever help us back or pay us back. In an evolutionary sense, this is maladaptive because it doesn't help us pass on our genes. And yet it exists in human beings in general, because once these adaptations evolved in human beings, they could be applied to maladaptive circumstances. And another thing, immorality. We're talking about morality and the moral sentiments so much, but it's important we talk about immorality as well. Immorality is something that everyone is innately capable of, because natural selection is selfish and cares about us passing on our genes. And the moral sentiments fundamentally evolved to help us be moral. But it also means that if you as a human being grow up in an environment where being moral isn't beneficial for your survival, you tend to develop to become an immoral person, because natural selection is a selfish process and the moral sentiments develop for selfish reasons. So for example, if you grow up in a really shitty environment, you're likely to grow up to be a shitty person. Not always, but it's a correlation. And you can explain that correlation in evolutionary psychological terms by just, if you live in a horrific home and horrific circumstances where being nice to people, being decent, being loyal, being respectful, none of that is rewarded. None of that gets you any kind of benefits, be it in the form of praise or warmth or resources or protection or connection. If none of that is beneficial to you, it's way more likely that you as a human will grow up with a warped sense of morality. And the reason why the human brain works like that, from an evolutionary perspective, why are humans wired to be more likely to be shitty people if they come from a shitty background? It's because if the moral sentiments aren't, in your case, being adaptive, your brain is flexible and it can de-emphasize those moral sentiments. And of course, this isn't a hard and fast rule. It's very, very possible and very, very common for people who grow up in shitty environments to grow up to be non-shitty people and have a working sense of morality. What I'm just saying is that evolutionary psychology does provide an explanatory mechanism by how some people can be immoral, because there's variation in people's genes. So for example, psychopathy is a thing that's obviously going to affect your morality, because there are brain changes that go on in your brain when you're a psychopath that help cripple your morality. But a key point to make is that based on people's environment growing up, their conceptualization of morality can vary, and their mental adaptations responsible for morality can be de-emphasized or can narrow in scope, to the result that people can be quite callous and harsh and cruel when they grow up. And it's not as if, if you take a bad person, it's not as if they're inherently incapable of morality. It's just because they're not applying their moral sentiments to you, because they've grown up in an environment which has taught them that they shouldn't be applying moral sentiments widely to people because it's not beneficial for their survival. This is what I'm saying. If you grow up in a shitty environment, it's not as if your innate capacity for morality gets shut down. It's that it gets applied in a different and more restrictive way. That's what I'm saying. So, we can see that morality's roots are innate, and they're of course selfish. There's also lots of variation in people's moral sentiments, and that leads to different beliefs among people and different ideologies and just different kinds and conceptions of morality in general. And also, there are correlations between between neuroscience and politics, between the way that someone's brain is structured and their political view. This actually, I said we can see this. Actually, what I've said doesn't really prove that at all, but I did just mention it earlier, so I'm going to go back to it. So, for example, people of conservative political views tend to have a larger amygdala, and people of liberal political views tend to have a larger anterior cingulate cortex. These are both areas of the brain. And the reason why I bring this up now is just to say that people vary in their genes, and people therefore vary in the structure of their brains, but also our environmental experiences when we're young mold our brains and change the development of different parts of our brains. So, for example, two different people with the exact same sets of genes, you put them in two different environments, they can develop radically different sides of their amygdala based on the environment that they're in. So what I'm saying is people's beliefs, i.e. their conception of morality and what's right or wrong, can come from a neurological perspective from both their genes and their environment, which you may or may not notice is the exact conclusion that we drew at the beginning of this talk anyway, that people's moral conceptions are a result of both innate capability of their genes and their environment. I do just want to clarify actually, because you may be a bit confused. You may be saying, well, Daniel, you're saying that morality is innate, but you're also saying that it comes from genes and there's genetic variation between people. Let's just talk about the definition of a gene. In any species, the genes are all the same. It's the form of the genes, the alleles, that vary. What I mean to say is that in different individuals, their alleles are different. So, for example, take two individuals, they have different alleles, and that might lead them to believe slightly different structured brains. But the genes are going to be the same. And the moral foundations and the in-group, out-group thinking, everything that we've been talking about in this past hour, are a result of genes. They are species-wide and therefore innate. That's what I mean. I hate to have caused any confusion. I just hope that makes everything clear. And yeah, so, as I was saying, from a neurobiological perspective, people's brains and by extension their beliefs are a result of both their alleles and their environment. But of course, all human beings have the same kind of mental have the same kind of parts of their brain that lead to things like guilt and conscience and love and empathy and things like that. Our genes are responsible for the parts of our brain which lead to the moral sentiments. Our alleles are responsible for the kind of relative balance of these different kinds of the brain, like the proportions of these brains, like the precise tweaking and proportions of these different parts of our brain in proportion to each other. So, to sum all of this up, morality is a consequence both of innate, species-wide features, i.e. the genetic plan of human beings, and also to individual kind of environmental experiences, and also individual environmental experiences and the society that you grow up in. Just to return to like neuroscience and that, in terms of like the correlation between parts of our brain, between neuroscience and the beliefs that we have, this really gets us into a field of inquiry called political psychology, which I find fascinating, but which is kind of a diversion for what I've been talking about in this talk. This isn't a political psychology talk. This isn't even really a neuroscience talk. I just kind of mentioned the fact that like we see correlations between neuroscience and politics, just to kind of reinforce this idea that our beliefs come from a combination of genes and environment. But again, that's just from a neurological perspective. What we've been talking about mostly for this past hour isn't from a neurological perspective, it's from an evolutionary perspective. And it's from this evolutionary perspective that I want to emphasize. So, humans' morality in general, is of course shaped by their personal experiences and the world that they've grown up in, and the society that you've been socialized to, and the norms of that society which you've grown up in. So, again, final summary. The moral foundations are innate. The expression that these moral foundations get, and therefore the precise conception of morality that humans and societies have, is environmental. And it depends on, again, it's just sort of like the world that you grow up in. And when I say world, I don't necessarily just mean the material facts of that world. I also mean the culture, the social facts of that world. And that applies to both individuals and societies as a whole, although of course the morality of individuals can, in some cases, influence the morality of societies. This is very rare. It mostly just occurs with very influential individuals like Margaret Thatcher or Lenin. What's much more common is the morality of societies influencing that of individuals, because if you grow up in a certain society, that's going to affect your conception of morality. And that sums up what I would like to say really nicely, actually. I think that brings us to a natural close, and that's come in 59 minutes anyway, beautiful, beautiful timing. It's worked out really nicely. It means I haven't even exceeded this hour. So yeah, that is this episode. I really enjoyed recording that. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed talking about it. If you are listening, I'm sincerely grateful and honored that you would listen to me yap and just hear what I have to say. I really hope it was found to be interesting and informative. I strongly recommend reading about this stuff kind of more widely. I recommend reading a bit about game theory. Read about evolutionary psychology as well. I have lots of evolutionary psychology books to recommend, but I'm going to talk about the sort of canon of books that I recommend at a later point. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Take care. It's been a pleasure.